You're listening to Future Frontlines, a podcast from Vespia, the Veterans, Emergency Services and Police Industry Institute of Australia. This episode discusses topics that some listeners may find distressing, including trauma, bushfires, mental health challenges, suicide, and suicidal ideation. If you need support, you're not alone. There are free confidential services available 24/7, Lifeline 13 11 14. Beyond Blue 1300 22 46 36. Open Arms Veterans and Families Counselling 1800 011 046. Take care as you listen.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are tuning in from. My name's Shannon Hennessy, and I am the CEO of Vespia. And a huge welcome to the very first Vespia Future Frontlines podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you all today. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians in the land on which we meet and work today, all over the country, the Whadjuk Noongar people of Boolaroo, Perth, where Vespia is founded. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the contributions of Indigenous Australians to country and community through their service in defence, emergency services and police. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the service and sacrifice made by our serving members across defence, emergency services, police and their families, and pay my respects to those who gave all in pursuit of serving our community. Lest we forget. So let's begin. The After the Fires study led by Curtin University in collaboration with Flinders University, Military and Emergency Services Health Australia, MESHA, the University of Western Australia, Roy Morgan Research, and the Bushfire and National Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, which is funded by the Australian Government Medical Research Future Fund. It's a lot of long-winded names in there today. But we love a good acronym when they come through those, so that's great. The National Survey investigated the impacts of the 2019-20 Black Summer bushfires, the mental health and wellbeing of emergency service personnel. The study involved over 4,000 participants from fire and rescue, rural fire, that's the Queensland vowel drop coming through, sorry, and state emergency services across Australia. The key findings highlight the urgent need for mental health support among first responders and really emphasises the importance of reducing stigma, providing opportunities for rest, and scaling up our support services. So I am very pleased to announce our speakers for today's session, Dr. Lavnie Rickers and Dr. David Lawrence. Dr. Rickers is a senior researcher. I'm doing great, guys, doubling over all my words. A senior researcher with extensive experience in public health and mental health research. Her work focuses on the wellbeing of emergency service personnel and their families. And Dr. Lawrence is a leading expert in mental health epidemiology. His research has significantly contributed to our understanding of mental health outcomes among first responders. So, thank you for allowing me a very quick introduction there, guys. We're going to get stuck in and I'm going to hand over to our presenters today.
Thank you very much, Shan, and thank you very much for inviting us to participate in the podcast. It was a big list of people involved, and it just, I guess, shows how many people are involved in conducting a large-scale research study. We couldn't have done it without the involvement of many, many people across Australia and across the different organisations that were involved in responding to the fires. So we wanted to talk a little bit today about our After the Fires study, but we also wanted to talk a little bit about what brought us to being involved in the study in the first place. At the outset, I would just like to acknowledge, as Shan has done, the traditional owners of the land. So Waveney and I today are joining a podcast on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We pay our respects to them and acknowledge their ongoing connection to the land, and our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today we are going to run through background to After the Fires and why we came to be involved in this research, talk about our understanding of the fire and rescue sector, look at what we found out about involvement in responding to the Black Summer bushfires, which were a very significant event across most of Australia. The main focus of the survey was to look at the mental health and wellbeing impacts of being involved in responding to major events such as after the fires, but in the context of being involved in fire and rescue and state emergency services support as an ongoing practice and career. And within that, we're also very keen to look at aspects of help seeking, aspects of stigma, and barriers that stand in the way of people seeking help when they perhaps need it for their better well-being. And finally, talk about what we think are the implications and recommendations coming out of the study that we have undertaken. So we came to After the Fires having originally been involved in the Answering the Call study, which was conducted in 2017-2018, which was funded by Beyond Blue and was the first Australian national survey of police and emergency services, mental health and wellbeing. And having been involved in that study, we felt that we had a useful platform from which we could then investigate the impact of the 2019-20 Black Summer when it came along, because we had not too long before that collected a baseline of the level of mental health and wellbeing in the emergency services sector. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we did in Answering the Call and some of the things that from that encouraged us to go ahead with the After the Fires study. So the Answering the Call study involved almost all of Australia's police, ambulance, fire and rescue, rural fire and state emergency services organisations. And we surveyed over 20,000 personnel, almost 15,000 employees, over 5,000 volunteers across the sector, and also some former employees. And it was the first time Australia had really had a measure of what the level of mental health and wellbeing in Australian emergency services was. And while a lot of what we found in emergencies in the Answering the Call study, people rightly say, well, I'm not surprised to have heard that result. It was really important that we did that. I think in part, one of the things that was happening around the same time, the Australian Senate was conducting an inquiry into mental health and wellbeing in emergency services, as an inquiry that they called the people behind 000. And there are a number of people who went to that inquiry and were offering testimony suggesting that the rate of mental health problems in emergency services personnel was no different from the rest of the community, and where there were mental health issues, that they were predominantly associated with problems that occurred in people's lives outside of their emergency services work. And I think the results of Answering the Call have definitively ended people making those sorts of claims. And it's been encouraging to us that across the entirety of the emergency services sector in Australia, there continues to be movements towards improving understanding of mental health and wellbeing and putting programs in place to support the mental health and wellbeing of employees and volunteers in the sector. So one of the main things that Answering the Call set out to do was say, as a baseline, what is the level of mental health and wellbeing in emergency services, employees and volunteers? And this chart shows three measures that we looked at. One was from the Kessler 10 scale of psychological distress. With very high psychological distress is calibrated to be a indicator of serious mental illness, the sort of mental illness that would require, likely to require urgent treatment by a specialist service, such as an inpatient presentation or treatment by a psychiatrist. High psychological distress is considered to be an indicator of mental health needs and perhaps the sorts of mental health problems that we would like to see people presenting to primary care and psychology type services. And we looked specifically at the incidence of PTSD. We found across each of these three measures, there was probably about twice the rate of mental health issues in the sector compared to the general population. And we think of psychological distress as principally being about symptoms of anxiety and depression. So these three conditions, anxiety, depression, and PTSD, undoubtedly occurring at higher rates in both employees and volunteers in the sector than in the general population. We did see a clear trend of increasing levels of psychological distress and probable PTSD with length of service, and it was strongly correlated with exposure to cumulative trauma in the workplace. But we did find that it wasn't just exposure to trauma, it is also aspects of the culture of emergency services and stigma and other issues associated with that, associated with mental health, that really impacts on people's mental health and well-being. This particular chart is looking at support seeking amongst people who have high or very high levels of psychological distress. We would like to think if people are able to articulate in a survey the symptoms of mental health issues that they're experiencing and the level to which it's impacting on their lives in terms of impairment of daily functioning, that those people would be seeking help in one form or another. In the Answering the Call survey, we found that less than 1 in 5 people who had very high psychological distress at the time of the survey had received what they considered to be an adequate level of help for their problems. And we looked at help seeking from the perspective of saying, well, has someone sought help or not? Amongst those who didn't seek help, was it because they didn't perceive that they had a problem? And almost 10% of people said, despite being able to tell us about their symptoms and the impact that it had on their lives, that they didn't believe that they had a problem. There was another 25% of people who said that although they recognized that they had a problem, they didn't think that they had any need for help. Another 20% of people recognized that they did need help, but didn't actually seek help. And so we think that these indicators, these parts of this chart, potentially suggest issues around mental health literacy and understanding of the types of supports and services that are available and the benefits that can accrue from seeking help in a timely way for mental health issues. And then amongst those people who did seek help, we asked them if they felt that they received enough help for their needs, and less than half of those seeking help received an adequate level of help. But as I said before, in answering the call, we found it wasn't just cumulative experiences of traumas that seemed to be associated with mental health and well-being. There also seemed to be a significant number of issues associated with stigma around mental health and well-being. A lot of people in the emergency services sector, as we all know, there's a culture in the sector of you need to be strong in order to be able to do the role. In order to be able to help other people, you have to be above needing help yourself. And there is also clearly, we found in the survey, a lot of reluctance from people to actually talk about social emotional issues. There are a variety of different ways that we can think about the concept of stigma. There's I guess one aspect is, have you, as a result of experiencing mental health problems yourself, been treated unfairly or inappropriately? So lived experience of stigma. But there's also the idea of, regardless of your own mental health status, what do you feel about the appropriateness of working with people who have mental health problems? And so one of the interesting things we found in the survey was we asked people if they themselves would be okay with working with colleagues who had anxiety and depression, and the majority of people said yes. And we asked people concept of what is called perceived stigma. We asked people to tell us what they thought their colleagues thought about working with people who had anxiety or depression. And less than 20% of people across the sector felt that their colleagues would be open to working with people with anxiety and depression. And so I guess one possible explanation of that phenomenon is people just don't talk about emotional well-being and social emotional issues to the extent that they just don't really know how their colleagues are actually going to feel. But what we heard in the survey wasn't just about these perceptions of stigma. We also heard people telling stories about negative experiences that they had had or their colleagues had had, including people who have been forced out of emergency services work or taking out of frontline work as a result of talking about emotional issues. So this particular chart, we found that only 50% of employees in the emergency services sector in 2018 felt that their manager was supportive of those who are experiencing mental health issues. Only about half felt their colleagues were supportive of those experiencing mental health issues. Less than 20% of people said in their organization when people recover from a mental illness, their career is unaffected. And slightly less than 50% said that they believed their organization was committed to making changes that promote mental health and well-being, and that they believed their organization had the skills and resources to make changes that promote mental health and well-being. Apart from these survey questions that we asked, we also gave people in the Answering the Call study the option to tell us anything that they thought was relevant to our understanding of their mental health and well-being. We had over 4,000 people provide comments or stories in that section of the survey. There was a very significant number of people who told us stories about themselves or colleagues that they knew who had been treated what they perceived to be unfairly, including people who had been forced out of their jobs as a result of mental health problems. So we think that it's not just stigma that people are concerned that they might be treated unfairly and that their career might be affected by talking about mental health. Many people had lived experience of that actually happening, and that being possibly a major driver of why people have those levels of concerns. So, with this baseline of understanding of the level of mental health problems across the sector and some of the cultural and organisational issues that were associated with them, we thought that this was a good baseline when the Black Summer fires occurred to undertake further research to look at what was the impact of the Black Summer fire. So the 2019-20 Black Summer fire season, as people will probably know, probably the largest set of fires ever experienced in Australia. And while there's been a little bit of argument about that, there's undoubtedly, in terms of the duration of the fires, the spread of the fires, the intensity of the fires, and the destruction that was associated with them in terms of loss of habitat for wildlife and destruction of forest and farming lands, but also loss of houses and loss of life associated with those fires. It was a very dramatic time in many people's lives. So we wanted to see if we could look at the impact of these fires in terms of people who are involved in the response. And the structure of After the Fires was to look at the shorter and long-term impacts of participating in responding to the fires with a survey 1 year post-fires and 2 years post-fires. And it was also another part of the study, which was principally led by the team at Flinders University, led by Sharon Lawn and Miranda Van Hoof, undertook a series of qualitative interviews and focus groups to get a further understanding of the experiences of some of the people who are very heavily involved in the bushfires. So in the first wave of the study, 1 year after the fires, we surveyed about 4,000 volunteers and employees across 19 fire and rescue, rural fire and state emergency services agencies who had been involved in responding to fires in some way. And we went back another year later and followed up 1,000 of the people who participated in the first wave to see how they'd been going in the subsequent 12 months after. So following up to a maximum of 2 years post the survey. So within the fire and emergency services sector in Australia, it's estimated that there are a little over 20,000 paid workers in the sector. The majority of them are paid firefighters. We think there's about 18,000 operational paid firefighters in Australia. That's small compared to the number of volunteer firefighters that we have. There are over 200,000 volunteers on the books of volunteer agencies across Australia. Because of the nature of volunteering, it's a little bit hard to know exactly how many volunteers might be active at any one point of time, because people can fade away from volunteering roles without necessarily formally withdrawing from their volunteer organisations. But we know that the sector is heavily male dominated. Less than 1/5 of volunteers and employees in the sector are female. And volunteers in particular have a older age distribution compared to the population distribution of Australia as a whole. And while part of that is associated with the fact that volunteering is most common in rural and regional areas, which do tend to have a slightly older demographic than the Australian population at large, it's definitely the case that volunteers come from an older demographic, even in the areas where they are volunteering. We know that most people who volunteer or are paid employees in the sector do so for a long period of time, and it becomes a career. And we know that when there are emergencies in areas, it is often the same people who volunteer to respond to them time after time. So there are many people in the sector who have extended careers of service. So first of all, we wanted to look at who was involved in responding to the Black Summer bushfires. And one of the things that was clear from the survey is Australia is critically reliant on volunteers to be able to respond to this type of emergency. Almost all of Australia's paid firefighters were involved in the response, but even so, they made up less than 25% of the responders. And I think when we first started working on answering the call, there were some people who said to us and expressed the view that volunteers are spared the most dangerous situations, and it's the paid firefighters who do the really tough stuff. I don't know if that was ever true, but it certainly wasn't true in response to the Black Summer fires. The volunteers and the paid firefighters who were responding were in the field for the same amount of time, responding to the same type of work, and taking on the same types of risks and challenges. So we estimated that there were 64,500 volunteers across Australia who participated in responding to the fires in one way or another, and almost 18,000 employees. Most of those volunteers and employees came from fire and rescue services, but there was also a significant number of people coming from SES services. And while those numbers look as if the SES has a smaller role in responding to these fires, if we keep in mind the size of the agencies, we actually had a very significant proportion of SES volunteers who were involved in the fire response. So we thought of interest coming out of the fires would be estimating the extent of the contribution that people made to the fires. And we've tried to do this with a simple economic analysis. It's undoubtedly an underestimate of the true cost of the volunteer effort, because we costed it on the basis of if a volunteer had been paid at the rate of a junior firefighter, how much would their time have been worth? And we estimated that there are approximately 1,800,000 person days of volunteer time contributed by the 64,000 volunteers who are involved in the fire response. And that represented over $500 million worth of labour in that fire response. In Australia, volunteers do not get any compensation for the work that they do. Some volunteers who have paid jobs are able to access paid leave to be able to respond to emergencies. And we estimated that that was about 1/3 of the volunteer force, and represented about $143 million of contribution from organisations providing paid leave. But a very significant contribution from volunteers who are either had to take unpaid leave, or who work in their own businesses, or are self-employed or no longer working, and that contribution was very significant. On top of that, we also found that there was a small but still very substantial contribution of employees who volunteered over and above their paid work to contribute to the fire response. So, in terms of engagement with the fire response, we found that over 80% of the volunteers involved in the fire response were involved in direct firefighting, a slightly lower number for the paid staff, and significant contributions across roles, including 40% of volunteers also involved in operations support, 30% in community support, and the other administrative and staging support that is necessary to mount these large-scale uh, responses. So in terms of time committed to the role, we found that 72% of volunteers with active involvement in the fire response spent one or more nights away from home while responding to the fires, with an average of 9 nights away from home on the fire response. 17% of volunteers were away from home for more than 2 weeks over the fire season. And similar numbers with employees. 73% with active involvement had more than one night away from home, and 10% of employees were away from home for over 30 nights for over 1 month. As I mentioned before, the issue of having access to leave for volunteering is an issue that needs to be considered in Australia. 66% of volunteers were in some form of paid employment. 22% were not provided with leave from their paid employment, and 26% were provided with leave but were not paid for the leave that they took. So access to paid and unpaid leave to participate in volunteering is not universally available. So the Sutherland strike team was acknowledged for performing exemplary work in very challenging conditions, during which one crew member was overcome by heat and evacuated for treatment by ambulance paramedics. Captain Kemp said he was a bit embarrassed by the recognition and thought everyone involved in fighting last summer's bushfires deserves an award. There is I guess, an outstanding issue around the type of recognition that should be provided to volunteers who do respond to these types of emergencies. And while there have been questions about whether we should be providing more access to paid leave for volunteers, or whether volunteers should be compensated in some way for the costs that they incur in doing the work, or compensated in some way for the training and accreditation that they have to undertake before they're allowed to do this work. We also found that most volunteers, why they don't actually particularly want to be singled out for praise or medals or awards or anything like that, do have a sense of wanting to be recognized by their agencies for the contribution that they make. And not all volunteers felt that the agencies responded to them in a way that recognized the level of contribution that they had made. So it was a research question going into after the fires to see if the size and extent of this fire season had any impact on people's willingness and commitment to volunteering. And while undoubtedly there are people who were very impacted by their experience, on the whole, people expressed that the experience strengthened rather than weakened their commitment to volunteering. And that across all age groups and even amongst younger volunteers, there was a higher proportion of people who reported being more committed to volunteering than less committed in the aftermath of the fires. What coded to that is we found through the qualitative work that a lot of people express that they're very committed to volunteering, in the sense of they want to be there to protect their communities, as opposed to the level of commitment that they have to the organizations through which their volunteering is organized. So another thing we looked at was the question of preparedness. And this speaks a little bit to, I guess, one of the main features that we find in major events like this. It is the very nature of emergency services work that when people are in need and when people are at risk, volunteers and employees who have the ability to be able to respond are going to go in and try and respond. And the size of the response took up pretty much all of the available resource across Australia. And there were a number of instances across the sector where the amount of people who were needed to respond in any particular location was much greater than the available resource, which then leads to people doing more work than perhaps they should in terms of the fatigue and looking after themselves at a very basic level. But it also involves people taking on roles that they're not necessarily trained for. So people might be prepared to undertake a certain type of role, and then in an emergency situation where a different role is required, people are not going to turn away from doing that. So it was interesting for us to ask both volunteers and employees how well prepared they felt physically, psychologically, and technically for the roles that they had to perform. And while the majority of people across both volunteers and employees said they well or very well prepared in all of these three domains, there was still a substantial proportion of people who said that they were being asked to take on roles for which they didn't have sufficient training. And these people were far more likely to experience mental health conditions such as PTSD or psychological distress in the aftermath of the fires. Another thing that I guess would have been completely unknown at the time of the Black Summer fires was the impact that the COVID pandemic was then going to take. So it was there was a very strong community response across the country to the fires, and there was a great deal of interest in trying to support communities to rebuild for a period of months in the aftermath of the fires. But then, of course, in March 2020, lockdowns started in response to the COVID pandemic. And many people in the community at large moved on to the next emergency that was facing the country. And so that resulted in a number of communities who were still significantly impacted by the fires, feeling as if they weren't being supported in their recovery from that. It also had an impact directly on both volunteers and employees in terms of their continuous engagement with their colleagues. Particularly in the volunteer sector. Once lockdowns started, there was a lot of volunteer organisations who stopped face-to-face meetings, and that went on for a significant period of time. And we know that informal support is one of the big factors that's really important in protecting people's mental health and well-being. The ability to be able to talk about the experiences you have and how you respond to them is really a critical aspect of responding to fires or any other type of emergency. And it was just very unfortunate in Australia that this COVID pandemic occurred so quickly after the Black Summer fires. In addition to the unforeseen circumstances and national disasters, volunteers recounted experiences of conflict that they had within their communities after the bushfire season. About 1 in 5 volunteers, 11,000 volunteers, reporting that they had experienced criticism from other members of the community. And some volunteers also reported feelings of guilt at not being able to protect houses in their towns. This is, I think, one of the interesting aspects of fire response that in a crisis as devastating as this, where there was such loss of property and livestock. And as we all know, fires can be very capricious, and it's very, very difficult to predict exactly where a fire is going to go. There clearly were instances of people or communities in the aftermath saying, well, if only you had acted in this way rather than this way, if you had been here rather than there, if the resource had been sent in this way, if you'd gone here then instead of then, the outcome could have been very different. And I guess that's a natural thing that anyone does in response to a disaster. Think, well, what if we had responded to it differently? But it's another thing that adds to the stress that volunteers in particular face, because most of the volunteers who responded to fires come from the communities in which they were working and are as impacted as anyone else in the community by the loss that occurs. I guess it is inevitable in emergency services work where people are spending significant amounts of time over years, it's just not possible that every job that you go to is going to have a happy outcome. There's going to be times when the situation is just more than you can be able to respond, or it's just not possible to be able to get there in time or deploy enough resources to be able to respond to that. Okay, so wave one of the After the Fire survey was 12 months after the Black Summer was over a period of about 5 months, but approximately 12 months after the response ended. And we surveyed, as I said before, 4,000 personnel, roughly equal numbers of volunteers and employees. And we measured their level of probable PTSD. We measured their level of psychological distress. We measured suicidal ideation. I guess one positive thing, if there's a positive thing to see out of this, is the rate of probable PTSD and the rate of high and very high psychological distress in employees in the fire sector had actually reduced compared to what was the case in 2017, 2018, when we undertook answering the call. And we know very encouragingly that every fire service across Australia had developed new or updated mental health and wellbeing programs, and were engaging with ways to try and improve mental health and wellbeing and mental health support across the sector. And it appears as if there are some signs from the survey that there have been positive changes in culture and positive changes in mental health and wellbeing within employees. However, it is still important to note that the rate of psychological distress continues to be higher than in the general population. And these rates of suicidal ideation, 5% of employees and almost 5% of volunteers saying that they had seriously contemplated ending their life in the 12 months prior to the survey, are more than twice as high as we understand the general population rates to be. We didn't see any change in the overall level of probable PTSD or psychological distress between wave one of After the Fires and answering the call, suggesting that the degree of change in mental health support in the sector may have been more concentrated towards the employed organisations than the volunteer organisations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we asked people in the survey if they had an experience of a life-threatening experience during after the fire, during the Black Summer fires, and if there was a time when they thought that their life was threatened, and if they felt that they had experienced a traumatic event that affected them deeply. We see there's a significant amount of overlap between these two concepts. So 31% of volunteers, 25% of employees reported there was at least one time when they felt their life was threatened. 22% of volunteers, 19% of employees reported at least one traumatic event in the fire response that affected them deeply. And we found that the rate of probable PTSD and the rate of psychological distress was much higher in those who had these experiences. So amongst those who had at least one time when they felt their life was threatened in volunteers, 9.1% probable PTSD, 11% of employees. And amongst those who felt that they had experienced a traumatic effect that affected them deeply, 13% of volunteers, 12% of employees said that they had described to us symptoms that made us believe they had probable PTSD. These people also reported lower rates of well-being and higher rates of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And clearly there's a very significant difference in rates of probable PTSD between those who did and did not have these experiences in the Black Summer fire response. Okay, as we can see between these two slides, being involved in the Black Summer fires resulted in twice the number of people with mental health issues that would be expected in the absence of fires of this nature. So what we have done in this chart is looked at the rate of mental health problems in those people who didn't have adverse experiences, life-threatening experiences, or traumatic experiences in the fires, said if we applied those same rates across the entire population, what would be the change in the estimated number of cases of PTSD, high and very high psychological distress, and suicidal ideation? And we estimated amongst volunteers that over half of the cases were in excess to what we would have expected. So we would have expected 1,600 people to have one of these three indicators: PTSD, very high psychological distress, or suicidal ideation. And the actual observed number was 4,000, with an excess number of 2,500. Similarly, amongst employees, although the actual total number of employees participating was lower, it was still the case that about 50% of people who had PTSD, very high psychological distress, suicidal ideation, probably would not have had those experiences if the rates of these problems that were the case amongst people who didn't have exposure to life-threatening and traumatic events applied across the full population. So we think that this is an indicator of the extent to which these particular fires have contributed towards people's lifetime cumulative exposure to trauma and associated impacts on mental health and well-being. As I said earlier, we surveyed people 1 and then 2 years after the fires, and we found that there were lingering mental health impacts for many people. We were also able to identify some of the risk and protective factors associated with mental health changes in the period. So one of the features of our study, going back to people 2 years after the fires, was an opportunity to see if people who were experiencing symptoms of mental health issues at 12 months continued to have those symptoms at 2 years, to look at whether or not those people had accessed help or support, and if they'd received the help and support that they needed, and to see if people's mental health was in general improving or worsening. So personnel with probable PTSD, psychological distress, or suicidal ideation in both wave 1 and wave 2, we found that 75% of people in the cohort had good mental health at both wave 1 and wave 2. 7.5% reported that their mental health had worsened. That is, they had developed one of these three indicators: probable PTSD, psychological distress, or suicidal ideation. 12.4% said that their mental health remained poor. That is, they had one of these indicators at 12 months, still had it at 2 years, and 5.7% their mental health had improved. So they had one of these indicators at 12 months and didn't at 2 years. So overall, the prognosis between 12 months and 2 years was slightly more people whose mental health got worse than whose mental health improved. Similarly, in terms of changes in psychological distress between waves 1 and wave 2, particularly amongst those who are experiencing psychological distress after the fires, the rate for those who had worsened from wave 1 to wave 2 were even higher. While distress can be due to many facets of life and not just to experiences while working and volunteering, the large-scale impacts of the Black Summer fires and the challenges associated with rebuilding communities and the accompanying financial hardships would all have been contributing factors to these impacts. One thing that we found in the qualitative research was people, definitely people who experience mental health challenges often find that they onset gradually and develop in their severity slowly over a period of time, often months, more likely years, and that there can be a substantial lag time between when people first have onset of symptoms and when the symptoms develop to a extent where people feel as if they should or actually do seek help. So while I think many of the physical challenges that came out of the fires in terms of the destruction of property and the needing to rebuild were clearly evident to people immediately after the fires went through their communities and rebuilding was able to start straight away. Often the psychological impacts are slower to emerge. So in terms of suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts and behaviours in the second year after the fires, we had 3,500 volunteers who reported that they had seriously contemplated taking their life in that second 12 months. Half of those, 1,800, said that they had a plan on how to do so. 120 volunteers had attempted suicide, 50 employees attempted suicide in that period, 12 to 24 months after the fires. These figures increased slightly in the second year, as we can see on the slides. While confronting, these figures are also important, especially where suicidal ideation has increased with the passage of time, because this is a potential indicator that people have not been accessing the help that they needed. And in particular, we looked at people who did not express suicidal ideation in the first 12 months after the fires and people who expressed suicidal ideation in the second 12 months, and said, were there indicators at 12 months that might have been suggestive of developing mental health issues? And we found that at 12 months, people who weren't suicidal then but went on to be suicidal reported quite high levels of binge drinking and using alcohol to manage their feelings and forget about their problems, high levels of anger issues, low levels of social support, and high levels of loneliness. And we would recognize each of these things as potential signs of developing mental health problems. And so when mental health problems go untreated, it's often the case that they develop into a greater degree of severity. On contrast, people who had uh, working in places where their supervisors and colleagues were very supportive, if they were working in an inclusive workplace, if they had someone that they could open up to, and people who exercised regularly at the first wave were much less likely to develop a suicidal ideation in the subsequent 12 months. So while the After the Fire study was specifically looking at exposure to trauma and the level of impact of the Black Summer fires, we recognize the importance of considering this within the context of cumulative trauma, because most people in the sector have been in the sector for a significant period of time and continue to work in the sector. And I guess one of the features that we have to recognize with a warming and drying climate and seeing more disasters on a more regular basis and more widespread and intense disasters is the corollary of that is more people are going to be exposed to traumatic experiences and more likely to be more often. So there will be more people who will have cumulative trauma experiences over their courses of their careers. And while you would not be able to say for any individual that an exposure to trauma is going to be associated with a negative mental health outcome. At the aggregate, we know that it is the case that people who are exposed to cumulative traumas, a proportion of them will develop mental health issues. So it's entirely predictable in that sense that there will be mental health issues in the emergency services sector as a result of the nature, the intensity of the work that people are being called on to do. We know that in the sector, there are a lot of people who have long-term tenures. We know that there are going to be more people who are exposed to large-scale events. We have to consider this in the light of what is the sustainable size of the volunteer workforce. We estimated that about 1 in 3 of the volunteers who are on the books of emergency services agencies around Australia were involved in the After the Fires response. But we know that the nature of volunteering is a lot of the burden often falls on a small number of core volunteers who volunteer again and again. And we don't know how many of the people on agencies' lists have moved away from volunteering for one reason or another. So we don't know to what extent it is possible to expand the size of the volunteer workforce. And if we're not able to do that, or at least sustain the current size of the volunteer workforce, then we're going to see more people exposed to more cumulative traumas with negative impacts that's going to impact on the sustainability of volunteering in Australia. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Waveney, who will talk about some of the other aspects of what we found in terms of perceived need for help.
Thanks, David. You can give your voice a bit of a rest now. So we asked people their perceived need for help for mental health conditions, and we categorised those people into 2 groups. So those people who received help and those people who did not. So for the people who did not receive help, they were further subdivided into those who did not. This is a little bit complicated, so bear with me. We divided people into those who did not believe they had a problem, despite reporting symptoms of a problem during the survey. Those who recognised they had a problem but didn't think they needed any help.
and those who recognised a need for help but didn't seek it. So those who did receive help were asked if they received sufficient help or if they needed more help. So overall, only 16% of volunteers and 22% of employees with high needs reported receiving sufficient help for their needs. That's a very low proportion. So this suggests that amongst those who did seek help, that there's still issues to resolve regarding access to appropriate and sufficient levels of help. So even though they got help, they either didn't get enough or they didn't get the right kind of help. So we asked people 2 years after the fires, those who said that they needed help showed there's little evidence of change in the levels of perceived need or the levels of help received. So over 3/4 of people had still not received any help 2 years after the fires. On a positive note, the lower proportions of volunteers receiving help may be explained by the fact that some are relying on informal more than formal support processes. David talked about having a supportive community and supportive colleagues around them. And it seems as though the volunteers are more able to receive and seek help in that way than the paid employees. So we're going to look at some of the barriers to help seeking. So those people that either didn't know they had a problem, or those people that knew they had a problem and didn't think they needed to, or those people that knew they needed help but didn't seek it for whatever reason. So seeking help for mental health issues is clearly a complicated and a complex issue for many volunteers. So when the focus groups took place that Professor Lorne from Flinders University conducted, she found that it was noticeable that participants in Wave 2 still had very vivid memories of the events of the Black Summer bushfires. She said they talked about the details of the days and the dates, the hours, the specific interactions and the decisions taken and so forth. So clearly the Black Summer fires had a huge impact on those people that participated. So there were several participants who had sought psychological counselling or other formal mental health support, but those people were also aware of other volunteers who were still struggling with mental health issues, and they'd not sought support, or they refused to seek support when people reach out to them. So mental health impacts were seen as a process that lingered over time, not something just arising from a distinct event and then resolving. People realised that as time went on and the wider impacts to the community were being experienced, that it was still having impacts on their mental health. So we asked people what the most common barriers were to help seeking. And among employees, these results are very similar to the ones that we found in answering the call. And a lot of them are associated with stigma. So most people, and this is common across all studies of first responders with mental health conditions, most people prefer to deal with their problems informally. So either by themselves or with family and friends. And this kind of suggests to us that instead of seeking formal help, they may be postponing or waiting to see if their symptoms ease and the problems go away by themselves, rather than understanding when and how and where they need to get formal help. So as we can see here, there's a range of commonly reported barriers among the emergency services communities. Fear of being treated differently by others, that their career prospects may be harmed, or that they would be seen as weak. These are common barriers across all emergency services sectors, not just those fighting fires. So there's a long underlying issue of stigma that needs to be addressed. So with the volunteers, it was a little bit different because career impacts are not as significant to them for obvious reasons, but nevertheless, they also enjoy volunteering and they enjoy what they do in terms of how they interact with other people in the community. And for that reason, they don't want to be treated differently. They don't want to be seen as weak and not up to the task of doing the firefighting. And some people also feel that they would feel guilt and they'd be a burden to their friends and family if they were to say that they were suffering from a mental health issue. So these are reasons why people tend not to share publicly how they're feeling. The ones that do best are the ones that are willing to talk to family and friends, but unfortunately there's quite a few who suffer from these barriers, and it's an issue regarding both mental health literacy and also perceived stigma amongst the community that needs to be addressed. So, on a positive note, we found that most people felt their mental health was supported by their agencies, and this was definitely encouraging news, because I don't know if you remember the slide that David showed early on in the presentation, but there were very low levels of belief in agencies supporting the mental health of their personnel in answering the call. So this is a positive change. What we did find, however, was that some of the focus group participants, 2 years after the bushfires, still felt that there was some way to go with organisational culture, and quite a few of them talked about aspects of being treated badly by the organisations after the fires, that paid employees received more help and more recognition than they did. They were a little bit like the forgotten people. They said they talked about a lack of transparency and accuracy in how their organisations undertook post-fire assessments of the events. Some people described these processes as damaging and re-triggering, and they perceived that the purpose of this process was finding someone to blame rather than constructively learning from the events and improving future responses. This is very unfortunate, and I think this is probably one of those situations where you need to hear both sides of the story, but the levels of resentment that are still being experienced by people who are involved in long-term firefighting is an issue that seems to linger and underpin a lot of their mental health issues. So emergency services have a culture of being strong and stoic and never admitting to weakness, and perhaps we need to change this way of thinking to ensure that emergency services workers don't equate mental health problems with weakness. So now that we've shared some of the findings from answering the call and after the fires, we'll talk a bit about the conclusions that we reached, and I think they're pretty self-evident based on what we've been talking about so far. And so we've also developed a series of recommendations that we've shared with the agencies that participated in the survey. So what we believe is that while the Black Summer response showed an exceptional commitment from emergency services, as David has said, the increasing number of natural disasters we faced in recent years, remembering that there were significant floods that followed straight on from the Black Summer fires, makes it even more important to learn from these experiences and to prepare Australia better for future disaster situations. So I've got a picture here of the Grampians bushfire, and that's in recent memory. I'm sure you've all read and seen about it. Now, this fire began in December 2024, and it was judged to have been the worst fire in that area for 50 years, or while records have been kept. This quote from a volunteer, but that cumulative effect, going back in again and again and again over a long period of time, it builds up and it has an impact. So recently, I did an interview with an ABC journalist who wanted to focus on the long-term impacts on volunteer firefighters of tackling these emergency situations. She wrote a great article, and she interviewed quite a few people involved, and some of the stories were quite harrowing, and it shows that people are prepared with no money and no recognition to put their lives on the line to protect other people in the community. But again, our findings show you have to wonder how many times people can be asked to put their hands up and keep going back to protect us.
So let's talk about some of the implications. We need to keep our volunteer workforce sustainable. How do we do that? We find that, a positive finding from the study was that commitment to volunteering in these roles remains surprisingly strong. However, it's equally apparent that volunteering can come at a cost, and it's not just an economic cost. So now that the climate we know is warming and drying and the fires are getting bigger and lasting longer, we're going to be relying on our volunteer firefighters more and more as time goes on. So it's going to be even harder to expand the volunteer pool when the impact of cumulative trauma may also impact on the number of people mentally and physically able to cope. So we need to do more to protect those who protect us. We need to increase levels of help seeking. Managers and supervisors need to improve mental health literacy so that they can recognise symptoms of mental health conditions and not just see it as poor behaviour. Organisational culture needs to improve. The underlying levels of stigma are still very strong amongst all emergency services. It's not just because it's, some people have said it's because it's a male-dominated field of emergency services. I think now that mental health issues are more and more in the public domain across the sporting sector, the political sector, that will flow into the emergency services sector, but it's taking a bit longer. It's possibly because the people in this sector are generally older than the general population, and so it's harder for them to change. We also need to have a greater number and increased accessibility of mental health supports and services in regional areas. What we found is that immediately after the Black Summer fires and after the floods, emergency services are sent out to these communities to provide emergency psychological support. However, a year and 2 years after the fires or after the events, there's nobody there. They might be able to access people via telehealth, but it's not quite the same thing. They need to have ongoing support from people that understand the community, that are familiar faces, that they don't have to tell their whole story again from beginning to end, and people who understand exactly what their needs are in that area. Now, this is something that has implications for the whole of government, not just emergency services areas, and it's an area I think that needs to be more adequately resourced. Reducing stigma and encouraging openness to discuss emotional concerns. As we've said before, particularly with paid employees in emergency services, they're very worried about adverse career impacts. They think that if they put their hand up and ask for help and say they're struggling, they'll be taken off the front line. Most of these people, for them, wearing a uniform is wearing an identity. And if they take off the uniform, they lose that identity. So it's quite a significant issue. No matter how many times they might be reassured that this isn't going to happen and their career won't be impacted, they still believe that it will. So I think there's quite a bit of work that needs to happen there, that people need to see productive examples of others that have put their hand up for help and either remain in operational work or return to operational work soon after accessing appropriate levels of help. What we've also found is, just going back to the previous slide, David, mental health literacy, so the last point of my slide, that's a separate issue. It's part of the stigma in that people are hoping that the symptoms might just go away if they ignore them. But they also don't seem to understand what symptoms are associated with a mental health condition and what they would call normal. So things like increased levels of anger, hypervigilance, being suspicious of everybody, not sleeping well, not eating well, wanting to be socially withdrawn. These symptoms might build up over time. So it's a little bit like the frog boiling in the pond. People don't realise themselves that they're actually suffering from a condition that needs help. So we need to do more to increase people's mental health literacy so they understand that the earlier they put their hand up for help, as soon as symptoms appear, the greater the likelihood they'll have full recovery. What we found that with the Black Summer fires, because they lasted for so long, and on average people spent 3 weeks at the fire front, and some people even longer. For many people, even though they were given time out after a shift to go home and get changed, have a shower and have a bit of a sleep, they didn't really have a long enough break to provide a sufficient level of downtime. And so it's a bit ironic to use a term like burnout, but I think a lot of people experience that during these fires, and they don't understand that they really need to have that break in order to process a traumatic event or something that's been very impactful. What they think is that if I don't go back straight away, then my colleagues have got to step in and take my place. But what they don't realise is that it can have a longer term negative impact, and it's better to take that break. But what we also know is that because the Black Summer bushfires lasted for so long and they covered such a wide geographic spread, there is simply not enough resources going around. And again, that's another issue that needs addressing. So I talked briefly about the fact that immediately after a disaster, mental health supports are sent out to a region to help communities that have experienced something significant. But what we also know is that just even in ordinary times, there are insufficient mental health supports at a face-to-face level in regional Australia. People generally have to travel to a large urban centre to access mental health services, or they use telehealth support. For some people, that's sufficient. It depends on the level of symptoms, I suppose. But for many, they can't make that connection with someone over the phone, and so consequently, they don't ring back, which means they get inadequate levels of support. So emergency services agencies that deliver the support need to consider how they're going to build up the capacity to scale up, if necessary, following a major disaster. So we've found in the past, through answering the call and after the fires, that paid workforces seem to be better equipped and have more programs and resources to tap into to look after their employee well-being. And so what we have found is that the volunteers don't have the same level of access. They're considered to be community members, if you like. And their firefighting roles or their volunteering roles are not recognised in the same way as needing the same level of resourcing. So based on these conclusions and implications, we've created 3 main recommendations. And while they're aimed mainly at emergency services agencies, as I've said earlier, perhaps a wider government response might be needed, particularly given that we're going to suggest a greater level of resourcing. So there's several areas where we think emergency services agencies could put their focus. As I've said before, mental health training is critical in helping people to understand symptoms. They need to understand what self-care strategies might help as opposed to negative coping mechanisms like too much alcohol. And they also need to understand when and where to seek help. So providing a strong peer support program we know can be particularly helpful when other help is not available. And the other strength of peer support programs is that you're talking to somebody else that understands the background and the environment that you've been working or volunteering in. So you don't need to explain to a psychologist over the phone what firefighting is all about. When you're talking to a peer, that person knows what you've been through and they can relate a little bit better. We need to get people used to regular check-ins, and we think that might be a good way to overcome people's reluctance to open up and talk about emotional issues. If they go and see a counsellor or a clinician on a regular basis, say every 6 months, they're used to talking about their feelings, and so we think it would be quite a bit easier for them in a situation where they've developed mental health symptoms, that they'd be happier to talk about them. One thing that we found from our other research, as I've said just now with the peer supports, is that if you can find counsellors that have a lived experience of firefighting or a knowledge of what's involved, it helps to bring down the barriers. People feel that they're not going to be judged. Some of the people involved in emergency services like to use what they call black humour, and not everybody else can understand that. They also want to talk about the things that they've experienced without shocking their counsellor. And I know from speaking to a number of emergency services personnel over the years that sometimes they've had to counsel the counsellor or comfort the counsellor because the person's been so shocked about what they've been through. When for them, it's not that part of the trauma that's causing them the problem, it's what's come afterwards. Another thing that we've found through our research is that family involvement is essential. Families provide support in the background to the people that are at the front line, and the families, we feel, need to be included in both the training and educational workshops to enable the family members to be part of the support mechanism. David talked about the importance of being able to have social support, and it's a huge protective factor for good mental health. And so in order for that to happen, families need to be involved right at the beginning. We think that firefighting agencies should continue the great work they've been doing in building a workplace culture that recognises the importance of self-care and taking breaks. So I guess what we're trying to say here is that if they schedule these breaks and people say, no, that's all right, I can keep going, that they actually step in and go, no, we'd like you to take a break. We think that's good for you. So just following through on these sorts of programs. And we think it's important that they develop a formal rotation system that gives enough time for people to be able to physically and mentally overcome and relieve themselves of the burden that they've just been through. Scaling up mental health support services. This is where I think it's going to need a larger government response. It's not a cheap thing to do, and it's actually quite hard to find appropriate level and experienced counsellors and psychologists. Someone in our team is actually a volunteer psychologist who works with Disaster Relief Australia and with the Red Cross. And she's recently flown across to Queensland for a week to provide psychological and mental health first aid to people after Cyclone Alfred. But that was just 1 week. And they had a long queue of people coming to see them every day. And when she left, she felt like she should have stayed longer. Well, unfortunately, that's not always possible or practical. So in the absence of that, what we believe is that government should try to tap into as many other community organisations in an area as possible and prepare them to step up when there's a large-scale disaster to come on board and provide those emergency counselling services. We need to train more volunteers to become peer supporters, so actually giving them the skills with mental health first aid training to recognise early warning signs and how to respond and how to advise people when they need to put their hand up for help and perhaps get professional help. We're suggesting regular check-ins with volunteer firefighters for at least 2 years, more if possible, following a major disaster. And we believe that should be conducted by professionals or other trusted peers with appropriate training. And sometimes it's better if they come from a different area. We do know that some people in a community are reluctant to talk to others in the same community if they're struggling. So possibly a situation where people from a nearby community could come over and help if necessary. So lastly, these recommendations came out of the focus group discussions. So while they wanted to downplay the importance of what they did in a way, they don't want a politician coming and shaking their hand. What they do want, and they want this mostly from the organisations that they volunteer with, They want to be recognised for their expertise. The fact that they've been out there fighting fires for decades. And sometimes they feel that when the paid firefighters turn up, they're sent, back to the shed. Thanks, we'll take over the strategic planning. And that can cause mental health issues long after the fact. Even though it wasn't necessarily intended that way, unfortunately, sometimes they feel not acknowledged. So they want to be acknowledged and valued for the contribution they make in fighting the fires. Without them, there wouldn't be enough paid firefighters to go around to do that. They also want acknowledgement for the mental health toll that comes with volunteering over time. And we've talked, both David and I, about the cumulative impacts of ongoing exposure to trauma. They're expected to keep going back. So every time an event occurs in a community, people don't go and say to someone, oh, it's all right, Joe, you don't need to come. You fought 2 fires before. It doesn't work that way. So they would like access to better mental health services in recognition of the mental health toll that they all are exposed to. The last thing this is a very difficult recommendation to actually meet, and that is people said to us that they receive training, but they don't receive training for something that's as large as the Black Summer bushfires or the Grampian fires. A lot of people's lives were threatened. I talked to some firefighters down in Denmark just this week, in Denmark, WA, who were involved in a burnover, and that's where they're stuck in the fire truck and the fire actually goes over the top of the truck. And one of these guys was caught outside the truck. He couldn't get inside the truck in time, and he thought he was going to die. In fact, he was absolutely certain he was going to die. Clearly he didn't. But it was just sheer luck that the fire came from the opposite direction and he was standing on the right side of the truck at the time. And the trees around him were so large, it jumped over the top from treetop to treetop. Might have had a very different outcome. So people are not prepared for the amount of danger that they can be in. Some of them don't have adequate equipment as volunteers. And so these things can have quite a huge impact on people. And after the fires found that in particular, that people that had experienced a life-threatening event or a traumatic event had significantly increased levels of mental health conditions after the fact. So in summary, what do we find? We found that over 5,000 employees and volunteers across the sector had high need for mental health support. So in other words, after the Black Summer fires, they had PTSD, they had high or very high psychological distress, or they were suffering from suicidal ideation. And we know that, particularly with the latter, that was twice the rate in the general population, and that's quite concerning. So we also found that 1 year and 2 years after the fires, only one in 5 people had received a sufficient level of support for their mental health conditions. So what we need to do is work out how are we going to meet the challenge of scaling up mental health supports when major incidents occur. So what if we're very successful and we have this great mental health literacy training and people do start to recognise when they need to put their hand up for help? Who's going to provide that help? These are things that we really, really need to focus on. Earth's just experienced its hottest year on record. And make no mistake, we're at real risk of another Black Summer. So it's important, it's vital, really, that we need to prepare for more huge fire seasons and floods. So it's not just ensuring that we have the right equipment, like the right masks. Some of the volunteers had to buy their own masks. We have the right masks, we have sufficient fire trucks, the fire blankets to support themselves in a burnover, but we need to make sure that people are mentally resilient and prepared to fight the fires. So let's learn from our experiences and let's make sure we can continue to have a strong and resilient volunteer workforce that's recognised, valued and supported by the communities they serve. So thank you, everybody, for listening. And thank you, Shan, for inviting us to talk about After the Fires and answering the call. For anybody listening today has been triggered or feels distressed by anything that David and I have talked about, we encourage you to scan that QR code and access support services through Black Dog. If you want more information about the research that we've conducted, feel free to log on to that website. We've got all the results from After the Fires there. We're also happy to take personal emails if anybody has particular questions they want to ask us about the research. So thank you, Shan, and I hope we've got some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, guys, for going through that report in such a comprehensive way. It's just staggering the amount of data I think that's come out of it, and raises some really good points, sort of holistically, what you noted around volunteering and how we're supporting volunteers, and you recruiting new volunteers. It's an issue we're having across sector, civilian or otherwise, especially in emergency services and defence. All those who would volunteer are. So continuously being called out, and the long-term impact of that, how we're sort of tackling that. I think for me, one of the most interesting statistics was one of the first ones, or I guess anecdotes that David put out at the beginning that I've referenced a few times now, is around that perception, I guess, of reaching out for help, that the perceived stigma, in a way, that they wouldn't judge someone for reaching out for help, but would feel judged if they did. And it's almost like we're kind of doubling up here, guys. We're not going to judge people, but we're going to feel judged. It's a bit of a roundabout. So how we're breaking down that perceived stigma of accessing help is really difficult as well. So some really fantastic stuff in there. And we do have one question so far, which hopefully that's going to pop up for us. So that comes from Chris from the UK, asking, do volunteers have access to the same mental health, wellbeing and trauma support that full-time firefighters have in Australia? In the UK, it's critical on-call firefighters respond to traumatic incidents and promptly return home or to work. They often miss out on the colleague support that full-time firefighters often offer each other back at the station. I think this might be tricky as well with the way that emergency services on a whole works here in Australia, being a state-to-state service, and that not all fire services are the same, and not all volunteering services function in the same way. But from your experiences, I guess, from this report and others, what kind of access, we spoke a little bit about during something like Black Summer and large-scale disasters. On the whole, what are volunteers having access to?
Well, I think it's a really good point that Chris has made. I think that we had almost all of Australia's fire agencies participate in the After the Fires study, and we had an opportunity to find out from those agencies, what sorts of things that they do and what sorts of services that they provide. I think it's unquestionably the case that the paid firefighting services, which are predominantly located in big cities, do also have bigger budgets and more resources, and they have more extensive programs in every state than the volunteer agencies do. Part of that is associated with the amount of funding that is committed to the agencies and the practical extent to which that funding can go to. But another issue beyond that is the availability of services. In metropolitan areas where most of the career paid firefighters are, there are access to a lot of services across the full range of spectrum, up to tertiary services can be accessed quite readily. With the volunteer agencies, many of them across the country are providing services that are based on telephone. Even peer support is often provided over the phone. And it can be very difficult for people living in regional areas to have access to face-to-face services. And that, while it's you can still provide good service to people over the phone, it is the case that, at least for some people, your ability to connect with someone over a phone call as opposed to face-to-face, or even your willingness to engage in that service, over the phone versus face-to-face is different. So even though the funding is less for providing services in volunteer agencies, there's probably that practical issue of, it is actually more expensive to provide services over a greater geographic area. That hasn't really been recognised. So I think there's double challenges in providing the level of support to volunteer agencies. And I think one of the really important things for me that came out of this study, recognizing that the work that the volunteers are doing, it's no different from the work paid firefighters are doing in any sense. And in some senses, it's actually can be a little bit more impactful because volunteers in regional areas, sometimes it's the same volunteers who are attending in a volunteer paramedic role, as a volunteer firefighter, as a volunteer SES worker, which probably wouldn't be the case in the metro area. And they're going to car crashes and they're going to fires and etc. And it's also the case in volunteers who are working in smaller communities. They're actually more likely to know someone who's been involved in those incidents and have a direct personal experience of it.
Yeah, I was just in a small country town in Western Australia. It has a population of just under 6,000 people. They have one paid paramedic. Everybody else is volunteer.
Yeah, staggering numbers, and to cover the geographical area that would encompass as well, to have one paid emergency responder. And then we're relying on volunteers, and you're right. And I think it was really confronting, I guess, to hear the content come through about how some of these volunteers during Black Summer were treated by their local community. Because right, that's when they're volunteering, they're likely responding to incidences or fires or other events that it's their homes, it's their community, and then that backlash. I think it feels almost un-Australian to
Shan,
absolutely, it is un-Australian.
What's interesting, Shan, is that that's happening even before the fires. So I was down speaking with volunteer firefighters in this town, and this town is the number one bushfire risk in Western Australia. And yet a lot of the people that live there don't want to participate in bushfire ready training. We were there to talk about mental health preparedness. They can't even get them to clean the leaves out of their gutters. And they feel resentful towards the very people that are going to come and put the fire out if there's a fire. So it's a very difficult situation. So if those same people were then to say, they've had a major bushfire in the community and fingers are pointed at them for not saving the community, I hate to think what the mental health implications of that will be, because not only will they feel that they haven't done their job properly, but they'll also feel, well, I asked you to try and prepare ahead of time, but you refused and now you're blaming me. So it's a recipe for disaster, basically.
Absolutely. It's almost the anticipation of something happening that that it's going to be bad because of the circumstance that you're going to, but if you don't even have that initial support from your community, it's just kind of compiling.
I'm pleased to say that this is a follow-up of After the Fires. So David and I are working on a project called Equip, which is a 5-year fully funded project from the Commonwealth Government to go out and do mental health preparedness training in 9 rural communities at risk of natural disasters across Australia. So 3 in WA, 3 in South Australia, and 3 in New South Wales. It's a pilot project, but you can see we're up against it already. So it's very challenging. So there are many, many aspects to this. So although, the implications and the recommendations coming out of After the Fires are very obvious, changing people's attitudes and behaviours is a very difficult thing to do.
Definitely. We've got a couple more questions that have popped through. We've got one here from Kim. Has any research or studies been undertaken into the barriers that emergency services agencies face in adopting recommendations? How can the culture be changed so that more help seeking is happening and earlier?
That's a really good question, and one that I would love to go to emergency services agencies and ask, because we definitely researched the barriers by asking the staff, but we didn't necessarily ask the emergency services agencies themselves what barriers they experience in implementing recommendations and changing interventions. What we do know is that the ones that do provide mental health first aid training, only 13% of the people in emergency services, this is right across the sector, all the sectors, actually attended the training, and only half of those found the training useful. So what that tells us is the training isn't tailored. So it's perhaps one of the problems might be they're having to choose programs and services off the shelf, as it were, rather than being adequately resourced to develop tailored training programs. Now, that's just an assumption on my part based on the responses we got in answering the call. David?
Thanks. I think that I had anecdotally the sense out of the Answering the Call study that it was probably the ambulance paramedic agencies across Australia that were probably most advanced in terms of thinking about mental health and well-being, and had the most strategies and programs in place, probably followed by police agencies, and the fire sector was lagging behind. And I don't know the extent to which the fact that the fire sector is the most male-dominated of the three sectors may play a role in that, but certainly back in 2018, there were a lot of people in fire who had very old-fashioned views towards mental health and well-being, such as you never speak about it, we're just here to put the wet stuff on the hot stuff, and that's all firefighting is about. And as much as they want to talk about, I think that from a organizational process, I mean, you'd like to think that when you do studies like this, agencies would be able to respond fairly quickly with recommendations. But the process of mental health reform, pretty much in any sector where there's been reform, we know that it's slow, we know it's gradual, it takes a long time for agencies to change. I think one of the things that we have started to see more so in police and ambulance, and hopefully we'll see more of it in fire. One of the things that I think has started changing the culture is people actually seeing real examples of people and senior people in organizations talking about their own emotional and mental health issues, maybe taking time off in order to address the challenges they've been facing, and coming back and having positive careers. We hear too many stories about people who've heard about the negative outcomes, people who've been forced out of their roles or been forced into a different role or treated differently because of mental health. We don't hear enough stories about people having experienced support from their agencies, having been able to recover and return to productive roles. And people won't, I believe that agencies are committed to mental health unless they actually see that agencies believe, by having lived experience, of people recovering and returning to a positive role. So the more we can see that, I think that will be part of cultural change in the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting to see in how many different ways and the forms that representation takes here. I think it was interesting you mentioned a gender parity with the gender influence as well. We hosted a workshop earlier this week and used ambulance. Far and away is more advanced when it comes to gender parity, and we're looking at what that means for leadership roles. But when then we look at the fire services, that some of the legislation has seemed so far behind because the pool of female firefighters to gain evidence from to justify some of these legislative changes is so small, and therefore we can't do it. So how are we able to tackle some of
female
these
volunteer firefighters, but they don't include them. And they all receive training, so they are trained firefighters. You can't be a volunteer and go to the fire front unless you've attended regular training sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. So how we even capturing this data is really difficult. So I think that might actually lead quite nicely into probably our second last question here from Greg, saying, from your research, would you recommend that we shift the responsibility of firefighting and first responders to a national model rather than a state model. So yeah, that's something we kind of noted early with the volunteer piece as well, that every state's doing different things. The way the agencies are run, we know here in Western Australia, the Department of Fire and Emergency Services, as far as their remit and their response to hazards, over 26 hazards, is one of the largest in the world.
Yeah.
So
it's a bit challenging, Shan, because it's not just fire and emergency services that put out fires. There can be a number of agencies, so parks and wildlife, land conservation and management, and national parks, local government. It varies from state to state. So if you were to have a fire, you wouldn't want the situation where somebody goes, oh, I can't put that out. We've got to wait for the Commonwealth-funded guys to come and do it.
Yes. There certainly are some arguments for moving to a national model, at least in some part, not necessarily nationalising all delivery of emergency services. But one of the things we didn't talk about today in answering the call, we did include a sample of former employees of organisations. And one of the things that we found out of that is, in comparison with, say, military and the defence system, where there is a structure, albeit there may be problems associated with it, there is at least a structure to support veterans who've had experience in the military going forward. And that really doesn't exist in any of the emergency services once you leave an organization. And even if you leave the organization because of the direct consequences of, the mental health impacts of the experiences you've had over many, many years, you pretty much lose contact with that agency. There's no ongoing support. And part of the issue, I think, with that is just that none of the agencies are big enough to be able to sustain that level. And there is certainly the situation you might retire from a career in firefighting in Victoria and move with your family to Queensland. Say, there would be no way that Victoria would be able to support you moving interstate. But I think not just in terms of life after people leave the service, there is a good argument to say that the degree of resources that agencies have to be able to support mental health programs, say, is roughly proportional to the size of the agency. So a big state, New South Wales and Victoria, are able to, if they set aside 3% of their budget, say, to support mental health and wellbeing, completely arbitrary figure, it represents more money than it would in Tasmania or the Northern Territory. And that means in the smaller states, the resource they have, the size of the work group within the agency that supports mental health and wellbeing, is small in those agencies, and that capacity can be a challenge in terms of being able to implement holistic problems. When we did the answering the call study, there are a lot of people who said to us, well, can you tell us which of the agencies across the country is doing the best? And we can learn from that experience and spread it to the other agencies. And when we looked at the data, we found that it wasn't really the case that any agency did better than any other agency. The differences were really within agencies, between brigades, stations, etc. The issues of mental health and wellbeing aren't just, they occur in every location, but they aren't just linked to a particular location. It's not like Queensland is the only state that has issues. Every state is facing very similar challenges, and every state, I guess, needs to go through a similar process of reform in terms of changing cultures, providing better supports. And while it's great to be able to tailor that to the local experience, the more that we can learn as a nation and share those experiences and work together towards some of the common goals, I think the better it's going to be.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's something that I've learned working predominantly with veterans and in the defence space, and now moving a little bit further into first response and working with these agencies, is that in the veteran side of things, we've almost taken for granted having a Commonwealth system and the ability to apply a national framework, and to not only the investment that's gone into it, but that when something gets implemented, it gets implemented for the whole cohort. That we're definitely trying to capture people as they move around, but it's far easier to keep them in a national system than in a state by state or agency by agency framework. So yeah, certainly going to pose a few challenges as we move forward with that. So we've got one last question, and then probably wrap up from there. So we've got Sarah, who said, thank you for an extremely interesting presentation. Did you work with volunteer and or employee firefighters in designing the qualitative element for your work or analysing that data?
Yes, we did. Is the short answer to that question. This was a very big survey. So it's a national survey, and it was through the Australian government. So we like to do things. We like to think we do things properly. So whenever we're designing something like this, we always go to both the population concerned as well as the agencies or whoever who are going to use the data. So we need to understand the issues from the population, and we need to understand what the agency's needs are from a reporting perspective in terms of what policies or frameworks or changes they may want to make. So yes, we conducted interviews and focus groups with volunteer firefighters, and we spoke to agencies, and we had a reference group. So the answer is yes.
Yes, the reference group included both volunteer firefighters and paid firefighters, and we did focus groups to design the questions for the survey, as well as focus groups as part of the qualitative work.
And in terms of analysing the data, maybe not analysing the data, but we've certainly presented back the data. David and I have done a number of presentations. We published the data widely. It's all freely available, so it's easy to access. We tried to write it in plain language summaries, so we've got a great summary booklet that anybody can read and understand. It's not full of statistical jargon.
Cool. So I have one final question for you guys before we wrap up this afternoon. For our organisations, so for your ex-service organisations and other non-profits that are looking to design programs based on recommendations that you've posed in this report, what's for them as far as analysing this data and interpreting it and using that to base their programs on, what advice do you have for those organisations? What are the key things that they should be learning from that data, and what does this mean for program development?
Well, I think one of the messages we want to get out there is preparedness for disasters is not just about having the equipment. It's not just about making sure we have enough PPE and the trucks and the planes, etc. It's also about making sure we have the infrastructure to support the volunteers and the employees who are working in these roles. Like I said before, you wouldn't say that for any individual in the sector that they're going to definitely develop a mental health issue, but we know that across the population, there will be a number of people who experience mental health challenges as a result of the work that they do in the emergency services sector. I think that's no longer a debatable question. And so we should be planning for what are the genuinely predictable consequences of the work that we're asking people to do. And people will continue to volunteer to protect their communities and do this important work. I think it's a responsibility on communities to give back in the sense of recognizing that it's not the same job as working behind a retail counter for 8 hours. You've actually done something that can potentially have an enduring impact on you, and perhaps we as a community need to have an enduring recognition back to the people who take on these roles.
And I would add to that and say, don't keep behaving as if it's business as usual. It's not. The fires, the floods, more fires, cyclones. I think we're seeing a big change in the climate environment. Whether you believe it's man-made or not is irrelevant. The change is obvious. So forget about what's caused it. Let's focus on the fact that those events are increasing in frequency, duration, and intensity. So not business as usual anymore. We need to change things up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're only just starting to see what the future has in store for us as far as climate change is concerned, and the impact that it's going to have on these natural disasters. It's just record after record, and they're not really ones that we want to be meddling in. I think as getting a gold star in breaking the HIG records and things like that. These aren't good achievements. So yeah, certainly you're right. Business is not.
I know
there is no business as usual anymore.
No, I know that the sector is planning ahead and they are looking ahead. So we don't want to be facile in saying that we're coming up with something they haven't already thought of. I just want to reinforce that message.
Yeah, certainly one to keep in the back of mind. So thank you so much, Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Ricketts, for joining us this afternoon and taking us through your presentation, through all of the incredible work that you've done for the After Fires report. Through our chat here with you, a lot of thank yous, and that they found the presentation very valuable. So that's wonderful. As you noted at the end there, you're more than happy for people to reach out. So I think the email there was afterthefires@curtin.edu.au.
That's right.
We'll make sure that gets posted as well. And of course, the reports in summary and in full are available on the Curtin University website as well. We'll make sure that gets posted up in the captions for everybody. So thank you again. It's an absolute pleasure. You've been wanting to host this session with you guys for quite a long time now. So I'm glad that we finally did, and look forward to seeing what you do next. And we'll have you back on the podcast when your next reports come out.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Shan. Thanks very much for inviting us
Shan.
to participate. Thanks everyone for listening today.
Yeah, a great opportunity. And thank you everybody for your thanks and your attention.
Wonderful. Well, the Future Frontlines podcast will be available online in the coming days, and very excited to see where the show takes us. Thank you all again for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Shan.
Bye.